G'day guys, have you just purchased a new reptile and you don't know how to correctly quarantine that animal before you add it to your collection? Well guys, stick around. In this video we're going to show you how we do it here at Cookie's Critters. G'day guys and welcome back to Cookie's Critters. For all the newcomers out there, please do us a favour, subscribe to the channel and turn on those post notifications so you don't miss a coming video. Now guys, along the way, if you do enjoy the content, please do make sure that you hit that like button. It lets us know that you're enjoying what we're doing. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, today we are talking all things reptile quarantine. Throughout the video, we're going to discuss why we quarantine, how we do it, and what to do during quarantine. So guys, here at Cookie's Critters, we quarantine for a number of reasons. Starting off with the low-level issues, we're talking about things like intestinal parasites and mites, moving our way up to respiratory infections, and then up to the highly transmissible viruses such as Atadenovirus in bearded dragons. In another video, we will talk about issues with carpet pythons. So guys, look, if you've ever had mites outbreak in your collection, especially if you're a snake keeper, you know how much of a pain it is to get it under control. It is time consuming, there is money spent in having to buy all the various products needed to spray enclosures to wipe down the animals. It is just a pain. Same with intestinal parasites. You got to take your dragon, you got to take your snake to a veterinarian, have a fecal swab done, and then for them to give you some antibiotics to clear things up. Now, if you do have an animal that does have a respiratory infection, well, yes, it is a health risk and it is easily manageable and easily treated with the right husbandry and with the right veterinary care. The biggest issue comes when you introduce that animal to your collection and your greater collection is now infected with a respiratory infection. Now, the biggest issue with that is if you've got breeding females either cooling, if they're carpet pythons, or breeding females that are broodmating, if they're bearded dragons, and this can potentially affect your cooling routine leading into breeding season. Now obviously if you're breeding snakes and you have to warm an animal up, feed it, give it antibiotics before you can then recool it once the antibiotics has kicked in, you know that this is going to almost render your breeding season for that one animal, or if not all of your breeding females, completely useless. So guys, the question is, how do you quarantine your animals effectively? So here at Cookie's Critters, we will never introduce a brand new animal directly here into our reptile room. So we have separate enclosures set up in separate rooms of the house just to mitigate this issue. Now, these separate rooms, the separate enclosures, also have to have their own separate equipment as well. So that comes to your feeding equipment, your cleaning equipment, or your lighting, your feeder insects. Everything needs to be completely quarantined, isolated just for that enclosure, just for that animal. If you start sharing it between your quarantine area and your clean reptile room, you're going to cross-contaminate and cross-infect your animals. So adding another layer to this, if you were to pick up a handful of animals from one breeder and then pick up a handful of animals from another breeder, ideally, in a realistic kind of environment, you need to separate those animals in one quarantine area and have a separate quarantine area for the other animals. If you were to house them all in the same space, potentially any airborne kind of viruses would now cross-infect, cross-contaminate the new animals that you have standby in quarantine. So there's an order of operations, a hierarchy of how we feed and clean here at Cookie's Critters. Now we will always start in our reptile room first. We always make sure that's our number one priority when it comes to feeding and cleaning. Now obviously if we're handling feces, strict hand hygiene is always applied, whether that's using disposable gloves or using the sieves, but always 100% alcohol hand washing in between handling your animals. Now moving across into the secondary stage, we'll always then move into our quarantine area. Now these animals will be fed second, always second. It's never deviated from this plan. Now these animals have their own dedicated feeding tubs, their own feeding bowls, water bowls, tongs, hooks, the works. You cannot interchange things between your reptile room and your quarantine room. So you never want to introduce the feeder insects that an animal in a quarantine area has rejected or refused or not finished eating. You never want to introduce them into your clean reptile room. Otherwise, all you're going to do is potentially transfer that virus into your clean collection. Now, the big question is, how long do we quarantine for? Now, unfortunately, the jury is out on this one, and there's not a clear answer. Now, some people do recommend that you quarantine for at least 6 months, but some veterinarians do recommend that you do quarantine your animals for up to 2 years. So at the end of the day, this will come down to your procedures and what you are comfortable as a reptile keeper and a reptile breeder in terms of your quarantine management. So what do we want to do during this quarantine period? Now, day one, you bring your new reptile home. The first thing that you want to do is you want to give that animal a bath. You want to make sure it's nice and clean. During this process, you can go through and you can do a digit check, make sure all the toes are intact, make sure the tail is intact, check all the scales, check for obvious scars, check the animal for mites. May sound obvious, but some people do miss it. The next thing you want to do is you do want to check and see if you can hear any kind of obvious respiratory issues. Listen out for bubbling and gurgling and wheezing, any kind of crackling sound that an animal shouldn't be displaying. If they are, then this is the time that you want to have a veterinarian check over the animal, make sure it is an exotic animal, like a reptile specific veterinarian, do a full health check. Okay, so you've decided to go down the avenue of having a veterinarian do a health check. And this is a great option for any keeper to do as a baseline. You can have your fecal analysis done, you can check their level of parasites in their intestine and their stomach. And at this time you can also do a virus swab as well. Now for snakes, yes, we are going to touch on this one later, but things that a veterinarian will swab for are Borno, Nido and Sunshine virus. Now, as this is Bearded Dragon TV, we are talking about Atadenovirus. Now, the most obvious sign and symptom for this virus is you will see your bearded dragon head up, looking around as if it's looking at the stars. Now, other things that you want to look out for are any kind of funny little head wobbles, any kind of twitching or shaking or paralysis or seizures. These things are all giveaways for Atadenovirus. So yes, there are direct overlapping symptoms when it comes to Atadenovirus and dehydration caused from an impaction. But an animal, if you've been observing that animal and you know it's been hydrating, if you know that it's got no impaction, then fair chance, unfortunately, it does have Atadenovirus. But if you've observed something a bit out of the ordinary and it's swallowed a large bug, or you just switched over its diet, it potentially could have a food impaction, which then could be demonstrating symptoms of dehydration. So here's the big kicker. To have a bearded dragon screened for Atadenovirus and Agmentadenovirus, the typical time before you can have that animal swabbed is about 6 months of age. Now, the animal does need to be an appropriate size because it is a cloacal and an oral swab. Same thing can be said about the carpet pythons as well. They do need to be an appropriate size for a veterinarian to do an accurate swab. Now, that being said, potentially you've brought this animal and it's only 8 weeks old, so you've got to wait 4 months before you can at least have a veterinarian do this test. Now, obviously it's in your best interest to daily monitor this animal, monitor its eating habits, its growth, its fecal matter, all its kind of daily things. It has routines and milestones it should be hitting. If it's not growing, if it's not thriving, then there's an underlying medical health issue, unless there is an issue with your husbandry. So at that 6 months age, your veterinarian is now done a swab, sent off to get the results, and potentially in 2 to 4 weeks, you're going to get those results back. Now you open up the letter, you've got the results, and it's come back clean that all of your animals are clear of Agmentadeno and Atadenovirus. Now, the unfortunate thing with negative results is they can return false negatives. Now, what you can do is in 2 to 4 weeks time, take your animal back to the veterinarian, have a secondary swab, wait for the results. If you get 2 clear virus screens back, then you can safely assume that the animal is free of that virus. Now, if at any time your animal has come back positive for either, these are highly transmissible. Do not allow that animal to come into contact with any other animal in your collection. Make sure that animal is completely isolated. Make sure that all of its feeding and cleaning apparatus, everything related to that animal's care is completely isolated and quarantined. Now, unfortunately, At the end of the day, this animal cannot be reproduced, it shouldn't be sold, and it potentially, realistically, should be euthanized. The saddest thing about any of these viruses for the carpet pythons and for bearded dragons is there is no cure, no treatment, and at the moment there is no vaccine. Okay, so there's two things here that most people completely forget and completely disregard when it comes to quarantine. Now, they might have their quarantine for their reptiles, for their animals, well and truly covered. But what happens when you go and buy second-hand equipment, second-hand enclosures? Now, most people, when they put something up on the marketplace, they're going to advertise their reptile equipment, their enclosures and their tools and stuff as cleaned with F10, reptile cleaned. Now, I personally would never take that on face value and accept that level of cleanliness as my level of cleanliness. I want to go through and do a full, thorough F10 clean, use things like bleach, use things like steam. There's so many tools at your disposal that you can kill a wide variety of viruses before you introduce an animal. So that goes for your enclosures, your tongs, your hooks, your feeder tubs, water bowls, food bowls, etc. Everything, F10 it all, quarantine your equipment. So the last thing that people typically forget is when a mate comes over and they're a reptile keeper as well, and they want to come and check out your collection, and they reach in and they'll pull out one of your dragons, they'll pull out one of your snakes, your skinks, your geckos, whatever you have. And at the end of the day, you don't know how clean their hands are, you don't know the health and the condition of their animals, you don't know their quarantine procedures. You've potentially let them risk the health and the safety of your animals. So guys, here at Cookies Critters, we take this hands-off rule really serious. We don't allow people to come in and handle our animals, whether they're young hatchlings, whether they are our adult breeders. We don't allow people to handle them. We will let you look at the animals, but please do not touch. The risk of infection is far too high, and it's not something that personally we want to take very lightly. And so guys, I suppose a bit of food for thought is you've gone through, you've cleaned and you've fed all your animals in your reptile room, you've moved into your quarantine station and potentially moved on to your final reserve backup quarantine area, and you've finished for the morning. Now potentially that cycle is going to be repeated later in the afternoon, especially when it comes to young bearded dragons. Your clothing, please consider quarantining your clothing after handling your quarantine animals. Change your shirt, change your shorts, change what you need to, and put fresh clothes on before you re-enter and handle your reptiles in your clean room. I cannot understate this enough that these viruses are highly transmissible. It does not take much to spread it through a collection. So guys, that's it. Quarantine here at Cookies Critters in a nutshell. Guys, I hope you did enjoy the video. I hope you've taken away something from this. If you did enjoy the video, please do us a favor, hit that like button if you haven't already done so. Please subscribe to the channel and turn on those post notifications. That way you won't miss a coming video. As always guys, if you've got them, keep your beard treated and your beard is heated.